We've been told our whole lives that the great fires of the 19th century were accidents, that a kerosene lamp fell over somewhere, or that imperfect materials caught fire from a simple spark. But you've been deceived, because if you strip away the propaganda glitz of school textbooks, it becomes clear that the flames in those cities were too selective. It seemed they weren't destroying chaotically, but rather scorching precisely what didn't fit into the new worldview. And the deeper I delved into the archives, the more persistent the question became. What exactly needed to be wiped off the face of the earth before history could be rewritten? Look at the photographs taken immediately after those catastrophes. Stone buildings with massive arches and three-story-high windows stand almost intact, while around them lies a desolate plain of burnt-out neighborhoods. Isn't it strange that, according to the official version, the fire moved with the speed of a storm, yet avoided heavy structures, as if it understood they wouldn't be so easily toppled? For some reason, it was precisely those buildings that resembled architecture far older than historians claimed were later declared unsafe and almost immediately demolished. What did these walls conceal, and who could have built such structures when, according to experts, the population of many regions in the 19th century barely reached a few 100,000? In the archives, I found a description of an inventory conducted immediately after one of the largest fires. The document claimed that almost two-thirds of the city burned, although satellite reconstruction, yes, such models exist today, shows that the affected area is larger than official reports indicate. Why is the actual scale understated, and why do modern researchers avoid discussing the discrepancy, the equal difference between a normal disaster and something resembling a targeted cleanup? Look at the development maps. Many areas after the fire turned out to be perfectly flat, as if the ground had been prepared in advance. Fire spreads chaotically, but the perfect geometry of a scorched space is a completely different story. And by the way, note how long it took the cities to recover. Just a few years. However, according to official statistics, these regions were short of labor, materials, and equipment at the time. How were dozens of buildings with monolithic columns, complex ceilings, and facades requiring highly skilled craftsmen erected? The explanation that this was how construction was done then breaks down when you look at the census data. In some cities, the population doubled immediately after the fire, although no mass migrations were recorded during that period. Where did these people come from, and why were the registration documents of these new arrivals filed in the archives later than they should have been? No matter how much I studied reports, diagrams, maps, and the rare surviving eyewitness accounts, the whole picture comes together. The official version defies basic logic. The timelines don't add up, the scope of work doesn't add up, and the origins of the buildings, which by a stroke of luck survived until they could have been demolished without a fire, under the guise of modernization, are left unexplained. But most importantly, these fires somehow occurred where the most complex, most monumental structures of the so-called old type stood. They disappeared first. It was as if the flames were scorching not the streets, but the memory of what existed before us. And when I began to compare the dates of these events, a frightening pattern emerged. Almost every few decades, a major catastrophe occurred, destroying the traces of a civilization whose architecture was too advanced for 19th century conditions, too perfect to be built by people with limited technology and meager resources. And while historians talk about coincidences, I see something entirely different. A plan that was carefully, consistently executed, astonishingly effective. If this is a coincidence, then it is too perfect. If it is an accident, then it is too advantageous for those who rewrote history. When you begin to view the great fires of the 19th century not as natural disasters, but as part of a larger historical process, many details suddenly begin to take on a frightening clarity. For example, take the descriptions of the temperatures that buildings allegedly reached during the disasters. Reports speak of heat that melted metal structures and shattered glass in minutes. But the official temperature of a city fire never rises above the point at which stone and metal begin to deform. To achieve such effects, heat comparable to that of an industrial furnace is required. Where could this heat come from in neighborhoods built with wooden houses and minimal fuel? Historians usually avoid this question, but it resonates too loudly to ignore. I found archival descriptions of eyewitnesses who claimed that the fire didn't move like a normal flame. It didn't simply spread with the wind, but seemed to follow a specific line. There is a firefighter's testimony that is particularly striking and underfoot. He wrote that the street they were walking along had already been scorched to an even layer of ash, even though stone houses had stood there just hours earlier. Stone houses, he emphasized, couldn't have burned so quickly and so evenly. If one person had written this, it could have been chalked up to an emotional outburst. But there are dozens of such testimonies. There are too many to call it a coincidence. Let's turn to statistics. In one of the hardest hit cities, stone buildings accounted for approximately 1/5 of the entire building stock. However, after the fire, only about 1% of this share survived. How can one explain that a fire-resistant material disappeared at almost the same rate as wood? Reports attempt to attribute this anomaly to explosions supposedly occurring in basements. But when you study the building plans, it becomes clear. Many houses simply didn't have spaces in which large volumes of flammable materials could be stored. However, almost all of these buildings had thick walls, arched passages, and foundations that extended deeper into the ground than the building codes of the time required. Why was it necessary to create a foundation comparable to those used in fortresses or industrial structures for an ordinary city building? Now look at the utility maps. Before many fires, cities underwent infrastructure modernization operations. This involved removing some old pipelines, eliminating unknown underground passages, and covering several basement levels. What are now called utility levels were previously ordinary underground floors, but official history maintains that these levels were incomplete or naturally filled in. However, photographs of exposed utility lines show carefully aligned walls, tool marks, and even sections of cladding. How could a natural process create such precise architecture? When you look at all of this together, it becomes clear. The fire was the final stage of the operation. First, the city was cleared, then the old buildings were destroyed, and then the rewriting of history began. And those who asked too many questions were sent to committees, commissions, and institutes, where they would gently but firmly explain that their observations didn't fit into academic methodology. But it was precisely this methodology that was created after the old world disappeared. It was a tool that helped construct a new narrative, convenient and understandable, devoid of explosive questions. The most interesting thing is the authorities' reaction after the fires. They acted too quickly and too organized. Literally a few weeks later, planning for new developments began, despite a lack of resources and a disoriented population. And yet the new projects looked as if they had been conceived long before the disaster. Too logical, too well thought out, too easy to control. Wide streets, symmetrical neighborhoods, and administrative buildings constructed in a style that would later be called state-like appeared. And yet traces of the old world sometimes disappeared literally overnight. And here is the main question, which brings us back to our starting point. Who benefited from burning the evidence? Who had the resources, power, and technology to carry out such operations across vast territories? And why do all these catastrophes strangely coincide with the beginning of the period historians call the Industrial Age? Or perhaps the Industrial Age is not a beginning, but a reset. Imagine, in the mid-19th century, vast expanses of Eurasia and North America are covered by architecture that is completely out of keeping with the technological level of its time. Monumental facades, colonnades as tall as 5-story buildings, tunnels extending deeper into the ground than the building codes of the era allowed. And suddenly, over the course of just a few decades, waves of fires sweep through these cities, each like the final stage of a massive cleanup operation. The official story calls it tragic coincidences, but consider the math. The probability of such events occurring in several major cities in a row within just a few decades approaches zero. And the more you look at these statistics, the stronger the feeling that fire was not an enemy, but a tool. But the most incredible thing begins not before but after the fires. In one city I studied the census, conducted just 3 years after the disaster. And here's what shocked me. The population had grown almost 50%, although migration reports indicated only a few thousand arrivals. How is this possible? Even with an incredibly high birth rate, such a surge is impossible. Either the censuses were overwritten, or people were brought in an organized mass manner, in prearranged transport convoys. But where are the documents? Where are the registration logs? Where are the traces of all this logistics? There are none. It's as if someone wanted this period of history to be invisible, a failure, empty. It is precisely in this emptiness that the key question arises. If flax was imported, then for what purpose? To populate territories from which traces of a previous civilization had only just disappeared, to form a new population that had never seen what had stood there before, to create a generation with neither the knowledge nor the memories of previous technologies. A century is long enough to erase memory, but not long enough to obliterate stone walls. So the walls had to be burned. Look at the photographs after the fires. In many places, vast deserts of leveled earth remain without a single block of stone. But stone doesn't simply disappear. Unless it's sawed up, removed, or hidden, it remains in place. And yet it disappears. It's as if entire structures simply dissolved. But if we understand that dismantling operations had already taken place before the fire, everything falls into place. The fire didn't destroy the building. The fire obscured the evidence of dismantling.